I want to talk about macro photography. Now we're going to look at several different options for getting macro shots, from your very cheap pocket change almost to your very expensive. I'm going to look at some samples from all of those different options, and we'll talk about some tips and tricks for getting better macro shots. One of the cheapest options you have available to you is something like this magnification filter set. I paid 15 bucks on Amazon for this. I'll have links to all of these products down below, along with blog posts and supporting sample images. They screw onto the end of an existing lens. You need to buy the right size for whichever lens you're going to use them on. And if you want to use them on multiple lenses, you'll need to buy the adapters, unless all of your lenses have the same filter size. These I bought for the kit lens, so they're 58 millimeters. A benefit is they're really cheap and they'll work with an existing lens. You can stack them for maximum magnification. You have a 1x, a 2x, a 4x, and a 10x. The downside is you're shooting through more glass, and anytime you're shooting through more glass, you're degrading your image quality. We'll go into detailed samples in just a few minutes, but because of the convex nature of the shape of these, you notice some real softening around the edges, especially when you start to stack them. So cheap, but quality is questionable. Next option is macro extension tubes. Now these are similar to the filters in that they work with existing lenses, but they have a benefit in that they mount at the other end. So you just need to buy them for your camera manufacturer, Canon or Nikon or Pentax. They sit between there, and so they'll work with any lens that you have. They simply move, or they simply make it able for the lens you're using them with to focus closer. You get closer to an object, it's going to be bigger or projected larger onto the sensor. Now these are about the same price, $12, $15, very cheap. Their downside is that they're dumb, in that they don't pass any communication from camera to lens, so you lose aperture control. You lose image stabilization if you're using it with a lens that had that. And of course you lose autofocus. So you're forced to manually focus. That's not a terrible thing, but it is something to keep in mind. The bigger issue though is you lose aperture control. That means that when you stick a lens on here, when you take a lens off any camera, it opens up to its widest maximum aperture and it stays there because it's got no power. It's got no power when it's plugged into these, so it stays there at its maximum aperture. That can make some macro photography very difficult. There's a trick. I'll share it at the end of this video that you can work around that, but it still involves having the lens on, doing a trick, taking it off, putting it on here, deciding that wasn't the perfect aperture, putting it back on. And so again, cheap, work with more lenses in your bag, but you lose that aperture and magnification issues. Now, let's move to a slightly better option. Smart macro extension tubes. You're going to pay more. These are about 70 bucks and they range in price. I've seen them from about 50 to 100. It's also important to note there's no glass in here. They simply move the lens further away from the sensor. Same with these. They also do the exact same thing, but these are smarter because they have the contacts for communication between camera and lens, and that allows you to set your aperture, to continue to have autofocus, and your image stabilization if you're using it with a lens that is different image stabilization. I didn't really show this with the dumb ones, but there usually are multiple sizes or widths, if you want to call it that, and they give you greater magnification. There is a loss of light. There's no real loss of image quality because you're not shooting through any extra glass. But I've noticed that if you're not starting with a very high quality lens that has a good maximum aperture, your results are going to be, well, less than if you were using a really nice lens. But again, still much cheaper than a dedicated macro lens. Before we start talking about a dedicated macro lens, let's talk about the next category, and that's a lens with the word macro printed on it. Camera manufacturers and lens manufacturers are really liberal with the use of that word. I have here, it's got a Nikon lens cap on it to be silly, the tiny little Canon Pancake 40mm lens. It has printed on the side of it macro. It is not a true macro I don't consider it a true macro lens, and most people wouldn't, because it cannot achieve 1-to-1 life-size ratio. That's not printed anywhere on there, and I've used it and know that's true. It is capable of close focusing and getting some decent close-up shots, but I think it's a stretch to call it macro. There are a lot of lenses, some zoom lenses like Tamron 70-300 that have macro printed on them. The kit lens for Canon, which again does a nice job of getting close up, but it's not a true macro. It does have macro written on it. Isn't that frustrating? That's frustrating. Now another option is a true macro lens. I have 3 on this table. We're going to go through each of them quickly. This is the Nikon 40 or Nikkor 40. It says macro, and in small print on one side it says macro 1, or micro as Nikon calls it, 1-to-1. This lens is able to achieve a 1-to-1 ratio. Upside of a little teeny lens like this, or macro lenses in general, is of course the highest quality, the greatest convenience, and I didn't really say it, but when you have an extension tube on, that lens can basically only be used when it's attached to this for very close focusing. It just changes the dynamics of the lens in such a way that anything further than a couple of inches is completely out of focus and not able to be focused on. Whereas a true macro lens is often a very nice portrait lens as well. The 40mm on a crop sensor, very nice focal length. The 90 Tamron, which I have right here. Difference between the two of them, of course, is its reach. This is a 90mm focal length. This is a 40mm focal length. Again, really nice portrait length. Getting a little long on a crop sensor. Great price on this. I'll put the links to all the current prices right down below. The Tamron is also an excellent price and only a little bit more expensive. And so far, I've been really happy with the quality. We'll look at some samples soon. There's one category that I'm leaving out, and that is lenses that have a macro switch on them. Or I shouldn't say I'm leaving out, but just going to mention briefly, that's an option as well. That usually just switches it into a mode that allows closer focusing. I don't know of any of those that offer 1-to-1 ratio, so not really a true macro, but again, they do a nice job of getting up close. Another option that I'm skipping over because I just don't have it here, and I've never tried it, is lens reversal kits that will allow you to flip something like a 50mm lens, reverse it, and you can actually get some very nice macro shots there. That is very similar to the downsides of a dumb extension tube, because of course you lose all connection to the lens and you're exposing the rear element of the lens. So there's obviously trade-offs, but those are often very cheap and can give you good quality. Again, if you're working with a fairly good quality lenses, and primes are often the best for that. On the Canon side, really the gold standard of macro lenses is something like the Canon 100mm f2.8L. This is an L lens. Some of the things that it offers that these other guys don't is full-time manual focus, so you can use the camera to autofocus, and with macros you often need to adjust a tiny, minute amount, and you can do that at any time. You have image stabilization in this lens, and this is the hybrid image stabilization that Canon offers. It's excellent, and again, it allows for some macro shots to be handheld. One of the things that happens with true macro lenses is as you approach that 1-to-1 magnification, these are all f2.8 lenses, Tamron, the Canon, and the Nikon, you actually start to lose some stops of light. It lies to you. It's no longer at f2.8, and when you're in manual mode you will see the screen start to darken if you're looking through the viewfinder, if you're using the LCD to compose, and that's just a fact of physics of the way these lenses are designed, and using image stabilization can let you get some handheld shots, but really for serious macro work with all of these, a tripod is super helpful, so that's important to know. So I think I just covered all of our options. Now what we want to do is take some time and look at the quality differences and basically how close you can get with all of these bits that I just talked about. Before we get to the samples and the side-by-side comparisons, I'd like to walk through the shooting experience with some of these lenses, both in a controlled environment and in a little bit less controlled environment. Now, we're going to start with a controlled environment because I'm going to be shooting the samples as I go. And I'm going to chop this up. You're not going to watch me change the lenses and all of that, but I'm going to talk through because there's some interesting experiences shooting with each of these lenses or filters or extension tubes. Now, I'm going to start with the Big Daddy, the 100L f2.8 IS lens. And in this situation, I have that image stabilization turned off, but it's really important to remember that one of the big costs why this lens is so much more than all of these other options is because it is a very versatile lens, and with that image stabilization, you are perfectly capable of getting sharp macro shots handheld. That's not something that you can do necessarily in the Tamron, because as you get to that close to that one-to-one magnification, you really lose a lot of light. Even though they're both f2.8, they're both losing a lot of light, and so you're going to walk that balance between high enough shutter speed and low enough ISO to keep things sharp, and the image stabilization on the Canon gives you a lot more room. It's a really nice lens. Now, I've got this set up. I'm actually using one of my cheapest tripods I have because it has this nifty little geared center column that allows me to move it up and down. So one of the ways that we're going to walk through this sample is, you could say, oh, here we go, we could shoot this, but how close can we get with each of them? And so I'm also running over here the wired in and running EOS Utility 2 using the T5i. It's a good test. I'll do some tests with the 5D Mark III too, which will push these two lenses a little bit more. For the rest of the stuff, it's a good test. Now, what I can do is, you can of course focus in, and you can watch on the screen as I focus in. It's a little bit darker on the screen than what I see here, but right about there looks focused. But I can get closer, and I know I can get closer because I can continue to move the ring until I feel that hard stop that lets me know that it's at its minimum focus distance. Now that it's at its minimum focus distance, I can start to lower the center column until everything comes into view. Now we can get even more precise. I'm in manual focus. I'm going to manually focus for all of these things, but that's again another place where the Canon really excels. You have a very capable focusing system and a fast focusing system, and that full-time manual focus as well helps. So I'm going to zoom in on the date of this penny. That is our test subject, which you can see right here. Now I'm going to zoom in twice. When we're getting to this level of, or I should say, when we're getting to this aperture at this focusing distance, our depth of field is millimeters. Or here in America, half, quarter, less of an inch than a full inch. It's very small, and you can actually maybe see some variation between the top of the penny and the bottom, the top being more in focus than the bottom is slightly in here, and you can see how the slightest movements, that's just my feet on the floor, wiggle. So, but we're shooting at a fast enough shutter speed that when I actually shoot that will not matter. And because it's on the tripod. So I'm just wiggling a little bit. That is the closest we can get. I think right there looks sharp to me, and so I'm going to press the take a picture button. And the image will transfer over. Takes just a second or two. Huge difference in the amount of focus that we have in the background. Now I've got the Tamron on, and you can see that it's quite out of focus. The Tamron is a slightly shorter focal length, 90 versus 100, and so you need to get a little bit closer to mimic the same. And that's another thing to keep in mind when you're working with these different lenses is, if you're working with things like insects, 100 is going to give you just a little bit more reach, so you're not as likely to frighten them away. And that's also true if you're comparing it against something like the Nikon 40 or the Canon 60. It really depends on what your macro subjects are going to be and your use. So we've lowered a little bit. I've already hit the minimum focusing distance, so I think we're pretty close. I'm going to use my magnification again to zoom in on the numbers and move down a little bit so I can see those. And we actually feel like we're a little bit closer to the edge of the frame than we were in the other because of this. So I'm going to move it up a little bit. Everything is going to get a little softer towards the edge of the frame, so it's not a fair comparison there. And now let's go back into our magnification, get a little bit closer. I think we're right on. One of the first things that I notice difference between these two is a good bit more chromatic aberration. We see some purple fringing there. This is close though. We're going to go ahead and take a shot. And in less expensive lenses, the Tamron is about half of the price with almost the same reach as the Canon, of course without that image stabilization. Overall image quality, we'll talk more when we put them side by side, but I've been very impressed with the Tamron, except that you do get some more chromatic aberration. And so now we're looking at the full Tamron shot. Now let's switch to a lens that has macro printed on it. So now we have the 40 on, a lens that has macro printed on it, but isn't actually a macro lens. And you can see that I'm actually about the same distance as the Tamron away from the penny. The lens, the end of the lens is actually much greater. This is its close focusing capabilities. The camera's about the same distance. Not that that really matters. Now you notice that the view is much brighter, and I've already lowered the ISO to 400. We were working at what, 1600 and sometimes 3200 before. So you're letting in a lot more light. You also have a much larger depth of field here because of the, ooh, that was 10x. Because of the well, distances and magnification. So one downside to these STM lenses is there's no hard stop, so you can't rotate until you feel any difference in the ring, but you can hear a very slight difference in the ring that lets me know the motor is no longer turning. So that is my minimum focus distance, and then I can work from there up or down. Actually, I just said up while I went down and down while I'm going up. Right there looks good to me. So I'm going to go ahead and unfocus that and take a shot. And so that's as close as we can get, which, you know, isn't bad. The penny is very clearly visible, but it certainly is a huge difference from filling the screen with the macro lenses of the 100 and Tamron 90. Let's switch over to the 18 to 55, the kit lens, which also has macro printed on it. All lenses, all normal lenses, are going to give you the closest focusing, most macro-like capabilities at their long range, at their longer focal length. So I've zoomed right away to 55 with this. This is the first non-prime lens that we're using. I'm going to turn my live view back on. And again, we have an STM lens here, so it has no hard stop, but you can just kind of feel or really see no change to it. And now, one other difference to notice that's very important is all of those lenses that had in common the maximum aperture of f2.8. I'm now shooting with the kit lens, and at 55, a maximum aperture f5.6. I've cut out a lot of light, but I can get pretty close. So let's see here. So that's my close focusing. I'm just going to move down until it becomes in focus, and I'm going to move into the center just a little bit. You can also see when I do that, just slight changes in the white balance as the camera is fooled. All of these are shooting auto white balance. So it looks like I can get just a tiny bit closer because I have just a little bit more room. Right about there, looks good. So let's go ahead and take that shot. Nice, it's bright, it's closer than the 40, seems to me. We'll wait for it to transfer over. I threw the 18 to 135 kit lens on just to see what kind of differences we're talking about. You have the same aperture available to you at 135 than you do at 55 with the other kit lens. And you can see that it is much closer, so I'm moving it back simply because the length of the lens, I've already found that minimum focus distance spot. So I'm going to continue to move back until it comes into focus. And now that we're getting close enough, I'm going to go ahead and zoom in on the date. That looks good to me, and it also looks like we can come down 800, ISO 800 in our test. So let's go ahead and take a shot. Let's move on and talk about go back to the 18 to 55 kit lens, but use it with an extension tube. And so these are these Velo models. And I had somebody ask, and I'll do a little Q&A at the end of this video about using a non-Canon extension tubes. Should there be any difference in image quality? No. All that the tube is doing is communicating information about the lens and physically moving the lens further distance from the sensor. That's all it's doing, and if there's no glass, a third party should be just as fine as the Canon. You may run into, with some cheaper third parties, some kind of communication confusion between lens and camera. But in general, the quality difference will be the same. So now that we have this on here, we can go back down to, we are much closer with the 18-55 anyway. Turn live view on. You can see as we come in here. And make sure that my focus is back to that minimum spot. It is, so now we can start to see as we get closer, it's coming into focus. And I went straight to the largest extension ring, the 31mm, and that's one that's going to give you the biggest effect. You can go to smaller ones if you find that the biggest is too much, and in some shooting circumstances it might be. Or you could stack all three. For the purposes of testing, I'm just going to do one with the biggest. But maybe I'll throw in at the end all three stacked. Okay, I believe we need to go back up to ISO 1600 to get a better view. But that looks to be in focus to me right there. Again, still limited to f5.6 because we are using the kit lens. And I'm going to go ahead and take this picture. I've gone back to the 18-55 kit lens now, but put on one of the magnification filters. There's 4 in the set, as I said, 1x, 2x, 4x, and 10x. I went straight for the 10x, and I'm actually quite impressed with how close you can get. And the quality, at least on the screen at the meantime, seems pretty impressive, but let's go ahead and zoom into this and make sure that we are at our close focusing distance. We are, and let's see where it looks sharpest. Right about there, which you may be saying that doesn't look so sharp. It doesn't look so sharp, but it is the sharpest that I've seen moving back and forth. So let's go ahead and take a shot of that. Let's talk about the handheld shooting experience now, which I've referenced a couple of times, especially when talking about the Canon. So the first thing to remember when shooting with any lens is to avoid blur from handshake. Your shutter speed needs to be at least as fast as your focal length, and including factoring in your crop factor. That's a lot of factors I just said. So Canon T5i has a 1.6 crop factor. This is a 100mm lens. It's really easy. 1.6 times 100 is 160. So without any image stabilization, my shutter speed should be at least 160. The Canon has a 4-stop image stabilization system in here. It's their hybrid image stabilization. 4 stops under 160 takes me all the way down to 1/10 of a second. So what I'd like to do now is take a couple of shots, moving my way back from 160 with both the Canon and the Tamron. And also we can again compare with the kit lens, which does have image stabilization even when you throw on an extension tube as well. So we'll take a look at that. So I am still shooting in tethered mode here. It's because there's a slight lag to the view you get, it's hard to see the difference, but when I half press the shutter button and I have something in focus and I'm concentrating on holding still, I do notice the image stabilization kicking in and really holding the view much steadier. Because I'm shooting live view, I'm not going to do one of my normal tricks in shooting macro photography, and that is to fire off a burst of frames as I get close to my target. I'm going to use that same method that I did for the tripod, which is now down here on the floor, and simply go ahead and hit my minimum focus distance. One of the nice things on the Canon too is it shows you your magnification ratios at each of these distances. So I'm going to hit that 1:1 and minimum focus distance, and then I'm just going to slowly move my camera forward in space until, where's the penny? There it is. Until the penny starts to come into view. I'm going to hold down the shutter button as well. So I'm not focusing, I'm simply moving the camera until the focus hits. All right, you can see that I had just moved past focus a little bit. And so in using the burst mode, fire off a burst of frames as you near that focus. You're much more likely to have one that is more on target than the others. Now, with image stabilization on, let's go down to an 1/80th of a second, half of the shutter speed that I should have. And now, of course, I can lower my ISO at 800 and find my penny again. And another thing that I can do is you can zoom in live view without focusing. That was more on target. and still quite sharp. I don't see any blur from handshake. Notice how thin the depth of field is. I don't want to make any estimates as to what the height of those letters are on the penny, but they're about all that is in focus, a strip. All right, let's go down to 1/40th of a second, and again I can lower my ISO, again getting a cleaner, sharper image for it. And again, we seem to have a clean shot, and I did a pretty good job of hitting target. Another thing that you could do, I've been lowering the ISO, but you could also open up your close your aperture down a little bit to give you a slightly deeper depth of field if you wanted that. One of the big difficulties in photographing very close subjects is this depth of field that becomes ridiculously small. Let's go ahead and let's go all the way down to 1/10 of a second, which is what we said we could get to, and I can go all the way down to 100 ISO now and find my penny, magnification. I could do 10x magnification, but it's just too much. So both of those are soft. So 4-stop image stabilization for some people might be enough. For me, doesn't quite seem. 3 stops is all. And so that's a good reference to know for most conditions, but it does change from day to day depending on how shaky your hands are or the conditions. There's a lot of factors that influence that. But it's clear that I can get 3 stops. Now let's switch over to the Tamron lens. I am using the stance, holding my elbows against my body so there's not a lot of shake, and I'm also holding my breath when I get close to actually pushing the shutter button. Let's switch over to something like the kit lens with a big extension tube on and see what we can do with that. If you're dying to know what an extension tube plus the magnification does, because those two things, well, these smart extension tubes are $75 and these are only 15. You get the dumb extension tubes, which I really haven't demonstrated. I will demonstrate those two at the end bonus. Image quality wise, they're going to be the same as these. You just have to do all of the control yourself. And as you can see, I've been manually focusing anyway, so that's not a big deal. It's losing that aperture control if you want to make any changes. And again, in these conditions, I'm shooting wide open with all of the lenses, which you're probably going to do most of the time, but there are certainly times where, because that depth of field is so shallow, you want to stop down. Okay, so let's get live view on. And handheld at 125th of a second with that image stabilization, it looks good. Let's drop our shutter speed. If you notice how close I am, much closer than I have been with anything else, and I was mentioning, depending on your subject, if you're photographing macro, insects in macro, this is certainly going to, alive insects, going to change their behavior, cause them to fly away, to turn away from you, most likely. So that's another consideration to think about, just how ridiculously close you are. But the quality is quite impressive when we take a look at what we're getting from these extension tubes with a kit lens. Let's take a careful look at all of these sample photographs now, making some side-by-side comparisons. So you've seen some of them as we've come through the shooting experience, but let's take our 100mm as a baseline and kind of compare it to all of the other options and looking at both magnification and quality. Both of those are important when we're looking for macro lenses. So we're starting here with the 100mm on the left and the Tamron 90mm on the right. And when we zoom into 1:1, we see there's a lot of similarity sharpness-wise. Where I notice some differences is especially in the highlights on the 8 and the top of the 9. Those are much more magenta fringed, a lot more chromatic aberration is the term for that in the Tamron. So one of the reasons you pay more for the Canon is you're getting these nicely coated glass elements that really control chromatic aberration in your kind of high contrast areas. Sharpness wise, they really are very, very similar, with the Canon maybe being just a touch sharper. Let's move on and talk about one of those lenses that isn't a macro but has macro printed on it. A pretty significant difference. We have the 100 on the left and the Canon 40mm on the right, and we saw that in the example. If we go to 100%, you see there's good detail there. It's nice and sharp even at 100%, but again, there's no comparison of the kind of level of detail. Look at this little dirt spot on Abe's beard. It's not really something that's visible over there on a true non-macro lens. Let's go over to the 18 to 55, another lens that has macro printed on it, but it is not a true macro. You see that's better, and it certainly isn't bad, and at 100% it's bigger, but it is softer as well. So at 100% it's not as sharp as the 40, but it does give you a little bit bigger, and you can see that dirt spot there that is somewhere right in that general area, but again it's fairly soft. The 18 to 55 on the left and the 18 to 135 on the right. Some framing issues there, but 18 to 55, I was impressed. It is more of a macro, if you want to call that, or it's able to get a higher magnification than the 18 to 135. Now let's look at the 18 to 55 versus the Canon. So on the left, Canon 100. On the right, the 18 to 55 with a 31mm extension tube. That was the largest tube. You could put on additional tubes to get a higher magnification. And for $70, you don't lose your aperture control, you don't lose autofocus. It's not bad. Certainly still not the same level of magnification, and you are shooting through a lens, and so the higher the quality of the lens, the higher quality images you're going to get. And with something like the kit, you're certainly pushing it, and you can see some chromatic aberration here, but it's actually not quite big enough to really dig into that. Now let's talk a little bit about the handhold shooting experience. We can go to single images for this. And here we are at 1/60th of a second, or 160th of a second, sorry. Handheld works, and let's get that one off. And 1/80th of a second, still sharp. Target not quite on target. Very difficult to do real macro work handheld, but that image stabilization can help. Here we are at 1/40th of a second handheld. Remember, shooting on the T5i, that shutter speed should be at least 160th of a second. So we're down quite slower than that. Then we hit 1/13th of a second, and we see soft images. Now I've got multiple samples at each of these different shutter speeds, and I'm showing you the best or the most representative, and all of my shots at 1/13th of a second were soft. All of my shots at 1/40th of a second were at least this sharp. A significant difference. For me, it seems like 1/40th is about as low as I can go in handhold. Now switching over to the Tamron, which does not have image stabilization, you can see that 160th of a second is fine. 180th of a second seemed fine, multiple shots in focus. 1/40th of a second, I've got this one in focus, but now I am going to show you some of the other ones because they all were out of focus. So basically, you could get lucky and have an in-focus shot, but you're more likely to have out-of-focus shots. So here's a clear difference between the Canon and the Tamron, and that ability to have image stabilization on. And this one actually, one more that is almost in focus. Now we've got the 18 to 55 back on with the extension tube. That allows the image stabilization. We have a much larger depth of field here. You can see that just the depth of field starts just at the bottom and moves all the way up to Abe Lincoln's beard. When we compare it to something like with the 100, it's smaller. Oh, sorry, that's the 90. When we compare it to something like the 100, that is a smaller difference. But here we are. Nope. At 1/60th of a second, everything's in focus, but down at 1/30th of a second, really things were out of focus. Now here we are using the close focusing filter on the front, the 10x filter at 1/40th of a second. Seemed to do all right. And again, 1/40th of a second out of focus. So I found these shots to be about 50-50. And again, shooting at 5.6, I'm a little underexposed here at ISO 400. I really should have gone a little bit higher. And this is just a tease of what can come in the follow-up video a good macro lens like the 100 paired with an extension tube. So we've got some real good quality here and some serious magnification. This image is not cropped or zoomed at all. This is 100%, this is regular, and there's 100%. So filling the frame with just that tiny date on the penny. That's in the bonus video. Stay tuned to be able to watch that. I mentioned that I had one trick for using dumb extension tubes because you lose your aperture control. And again, I shot wide open with all of these. I didn't change my aperture, but it's pretty rare that you leave your aperture wide open because you're working with depths of field, as you saw, that are incredibly small. So I just actually had all of the extension tubes on here with the Canon lens, filming a little bit of the follow-up video that I'll tease in a minute. It's not that good. But, well, actually, have you ever really seen Abe Lincoln's bow tie? It's pretty impressive. Now, one of the ways that you can get an aperture different than wide open on a lens when you take it off to mount on an extension tube like one of these guys is to use your aperture preview button. Right here. I forget where it is. This tiny little button. Did you even know it was there? T5Is, Canons have them. Nikons on the lower level models do not have an aperture preview, I think. I'm pretty sure about that. But here's what you do. You set your aperture to something. I'm setting it to f4. Now, when you, what you don't know is when you take a picture, not only is the shutter moving, but the aperture blades close down to your desired aperture and then open back up. If you press the little aperture preview button, they'll do that. And you can see them. Not on this lens, they're too far down in there and it's too dark. But maybe you can hear them. And if not, I'll dig up one of my old videos that shows that. So it closes those apertures down temporarily. It's called aperture preview, and then gives you a more realistic view, the depth of field that you're going to get in your shot. That's what that little button's for. If you hold the button down, and while you're holding it down, unlock the lens, you should remove its contact, the aperture is now locked at that location. Some of you are gasping, it's okay, it's all right. Just don't do raspberries in there. Now, you can then mount it on one of these dumb extension tubes. I'm calling them dumb not in the way that derogatory, but just saying that there's no information flowing, so they are not smart, and it will stay at that aperture. This works for any lens at all, if you need to. Another tip that I had, and I've shown this already earlier, is by hitting your minimum focus spot, and then you move the camera through space to get your focus. Because trying to hold it in one place and focusing at the same time is very difficult, whereas the only thing you're concentrating on right now is moving it backward or forward. If you're serious about photography, you saw me use this cheapy tripod in a vertical fashion because it had a geared rail that allowed me to make minute adjustments. Just like in science class, you might remember, that's how the microscope focuses. It does not, some do, but it does not change the glass inside, it simply moves it up and down, and that's an easier way. There are bellows and rails that you can mount your camera on that allow for very tiny, precise adjustments forward and backward, and that's how you can really dial in your focus. Use that magnification on the back as well if you're really trying to nail it and you have a subject that's not going to move on you. Now, I asked some people on Facebook for questions. If you have not joined my Facebook page, you should come on over and give it a like. I post tips, tricks, have conversations with folks, and ask questions from time to time. And I said I'm going to be doing a macro video. What kind of macro photography questions do you have? So I'm going to chop this up a little bit, but let's cover it a little. Let's go through some of them. The first question is, and I didn't review this lens here, but it's about the Canon 60mm EFS lens. Is it a good lens? Absolutely. It is only for crop cameras, that's the EFS designation, and it is a true macro lens in that it gives you 1:1 magnification. It's a very nice lens, and if you're curious about macro photography, it's a fine place to start. One of the other nice things about it is that it's a really nice focal length for tight portraits. Remember, any of these real lenses, these guys, not extension tubes or filters, are perfectly usable for non-macro functions, and 60mm on a crop sensor is a nice tight portrait length for headshots, and at f2.8, that's going to look great. So that's great. Now, if you are going to be photographing a lot of insects or shy creatures, I'm not sure what else could be besides insects that are small, that is when you might want to consider stepping up to a longer focal length that it gives you a little bit more of that magnification at a further distance. That will keep those shy creatures from flying or slithering away. And the 100 is even a little bit more. What you're really paying for in the 100 is there isn't a huge sharpness difference. There is. There is a difference, I should say. It's just not huge. But you have way less chromatic aberration. This lens handles itself really well in tricky light situations where some of the others, like the 60 as well, start to suffer. I don't want to say they fall apart, but they start to suffer. And then the other big one is the full-time manual focus and that image stabilization, which if you watch this whole video, you know will give you up to 4 stops of image stabilization. And I found it to be about 3.5 is what you actually get. That makes handheld macro shots very possible in many different kinds of light situations. You're not going to run into that necessarily on the Tamron. You're going to be struggling way sooner than you would on the Canon. The good news about the 60 though is because it's that wider focal length, it does let in more light, and you won't find yourself struggling and needing the very slow shutter speeds as often. So even though it doesn't have image stabilization. And also, these prime lenses, good prime lenses that you're starting with, like the Macro 60, their resale value, look at their used prices. They're often very little difference from new. $50 to $100. Think about buying that lens and having it for 2, 3, 4 years and then deciding to sell it and move up to something more serious. You're not going to lose much money on it. So that's always a consideration. It's the kit lenses and just zoom or telephotos in general often start to lose their price, especially the mid and lower level lenses. So don't worry so much about that. Other questions? So depth of field. Lots of questions about depth of field. As you saw, it becomes incredibly narrow. There are some of those shots where the width of the penny, isn't even completely, the background is very soft. What I'm trying to say is your depth of field is very, very narrow. What can you do about that? Somebody else answered and suggested, Frank did a really nice suggestion, shoot from a little bit further back and crop later. That's the only real way you can deal with that in a single image. There's a trick of, well, first off, bring in as much light as possible. And I was shooting with this guy just to have. They sell macro LED lights. They're a ring that fits around the outside of your lens that throws a lot of light evenly all around your subject. That will also help you go to a higher aperture that will give you more depth of field. But Roger here is saying even at f32, only the insect's head is in focus. That's right, move back a little bit. Your other option for non-moving subjects is focus stacking. And Magic Lantern software will do that. The DSLR controller software will do that. And that will allow you to shoot a series of images, has to be on a tripod, at focus points from X to Z, X to Y or Y to Z. And then in Photoshop, you sandwich all of the in-focus parts together and create one composition that has a larger depth of field. It's cumbersome. It only works in very certain situations. Any kind of movement, if you're shooting a pretty flower and there's the slightest breeze, all of that is going to make it more difficult, but that is an option. And there's a question of what exactly is a macro lens. I think I've already answered that in this video, but a true macro lens is one that gives you at least 1-to-1 magnification. That was true on film, and I believe that's how it still works in digital. So a penny this size should be projected the same size onto the sensor. And it doesn't matter if you're working with a crop sensor or a full frame sensor, it should be able to give that to you. And someone says, as a complete macro virgin, where do I start? Well, if you're a Canon shooter, I think you start with a 60. If you already have the 50, well, maybe go ahead and try some extension tubes, $75. Or the filters. I tell you though, the filters I'm not real happy with because you can't use them with all of your different lenses unless you buy the adapters. The quality, as we saw, is is decent for the price, but they're limiting in a lot of other ways and talking about the edges as well. So I really think extension tubes, smart ones, are one way to go, but another way to go is on the Canon side, the 60 is a great place to start, and on Nikon, the 40mm is a great place to start. Very affordable. Any drawbacks to buying non-branded extension tubes? I think I mentioned that already in this video if I didn't cut it out, and the answer is no. There's no glass in here. You can see my finger. It is just passing the information through and moving the focus point on, slightly differently on the sensor, and that allows you to shoot closer. And non-brand, Canon brand, seem to work just fine. There may be some lens communication confusion with some, but otherwise I think it works well. I think we'll wrap up this very long video. Oh, hey, I just was wondering what happens when you put on an extension tube and a magnifying glass. I know I said I'd show that at the end, but you know what? I want you to work for it a little bit. If this video gets 200 likes, I'll put up a short completion video that shows what does it look like when you use one of the filters along with the kit lens and an extension tube. Or what does it look like when you use an extension tube with an already serious macro lens? So get liking. If you appreciated this video, that's the easiest way to show me that. If you haven't subscribed, I'd love for you to take a moment and hit that subscribe button as well. And this video did take a lot of work. Some of this gear I rented, and that all had costs to it. If you plan to buy any of this gear, there's links right down to below, and I'd appreciate it if you use those. Thanks so much for watching. Hit that like button. I'll pay attention and get out the extra bonus video soon. Thanks so much.